Thanks very much, everybody. Have I got anybody here from Queensland Treasury? Good, they're all back at work. Just wanted to check. So a couple of things. One, I'm a bit in awe that I'm here today with John Wanner. When I got the gig as CFO of Brisbane City Council, I came out of banking, and John mentioned I had a history in banking, and that's with a B. And I got a book on public sector budgeting that was written by John, which essentially said, if a government's got $1,000 of revenue, you say to the politicians, what do you want to do with your discretionary $10? Because the rest is already committed. And that's certainly been a challenge in the last 16 months. So very pleased to be here today. I will apologise in advance. I've actually been quite crook, so if my voice gives out, that's probably a blessing that I'll have to finish early. So we'll just see how we go. I want to talk a little bit about, who here is from Queensland, just to give me a sense of, okay, so most people are from God's country, so that's good. So I just want to give you a little bit of a sense about where we are. And I know John helpfully mentioned before, listen, don't talk too much about the Commission of Audit. It might have been helpful if I'd had that before I did my slides. So I am going to talk about the Commission of Audit, the economic position of the state, but more particularly, the opportunities that presents for the public service in Queensland in ensuring that the services that we're delivering to the community are one, first and foremost, services that the government believes, following its conversation with the community, are services that should be delivered, and then more particularly, number two, how should those services actually be delivered? So where are we at as a state? Looking across the top line there, so gross state products over with the federal government, that'd be GDP. The outcome in 11-12 was 4%. It's quite flat for the next few years, and you can see that in 15-16, it jumps up to 6%. That's because the LNG royalties, because of those huge LNG projects in Gladstone, come to bear in terms of revenue for the state in an export sense, hence the inclusion of the gross state product. It's not going to feel like 6%. So, if you were, in the general sense, if you heard a 6% growth rate, you'd think, gee, rock and roll, how good's this? It's not going to feel like 6 because a lot of that additional gross state product will be coming from a very small area of the state. If you were getting a 6% growth rate and it was, in the majority of it was coming through, construction or retail, etc., it'd feel a lot better. If you were getting it through tourism, it'd feel a lot better because it'd be employing a lot more people and more money would be sloshing around most areas of the state. So it's a great number, but it's not going to feel like it to a lot of people. And you can also see, looking at the unemployment rate there, we see that that's sneaking up over the last couple of years, and then our projection is by 16-17 it'll be back down to 5.25. Inflation we're seeing is staying reasonably steady. Population, it would be fantastic to see population increase by more. We are seeing some increase from 11-12, but overall it would be lovely if we could actually see population pick up even further. So you can see that growth that I talked about that we're going to see come through in 15-16 is very much that conversion from the LNG investments phase, where they're actually building the tankers, through to the actual export phase. The period from 07-08 through to 11-12 was very low. Major contributor to that was the GFC, but also the floods that devastated Queensland in both the summer of 10-11 and also what we've just had in 12-13. We see the household sector hopefully as improving somewhat. Part of the reason it's had the kick up there from the low of 9-10 is the floods. In a perverse sense, when you have a lot of damage to the economy following a natural disaster, people have to replace white goods, replace roofs, houses, clothing, etc. So that's why there's some part of a kick up. We're hopeful that will continue on an upward trend over the next couple of years. Hopefully that will also then drive stronger labour market outcomes. You can see the long run average unemployment rate is 7.25% on the right hand side going through. Does anyone want to talk about that before I move on? So I'm basically just trying to give an update on where we're seeing the state position overall. No surprise that Queensland is outperforming every other state, save for Western Australia, which I don't really think that both Western Australians count. And certainly in 15-16, we outperform everybody. So so it really goes to Queensland's strength. We're more than a one-trick pony. Resources are a huge contributor to the state's economic product, but more particularly, we've got other sectors as well, which we're really trying to encourage. So that's the 4 pillars that the Queensland government talks about, which is construction, tourism, mining and resources, and help me out. Come on, what's the 4th one? Now, I've got 15 answers coming at me. Give me one. Agriculture, thank you. Anybody here from the land? Okay, beef, crops. What do you do? Got some beef. Your prices are not good. No, so over half the state's drought declared. Prices are really not good, so it's a tough time out there. But you know, agriculture employs a lot of people. It produces a lot of product. It's really an area that we'd love to see improve. The good news is there is some soil profile around. If we could just see markets improve, hopefully it will feel a bit better for you guys as well. So the government adopted in July last year, following the Interim Commission of Audit report, that it would have 4 fiscal principles. So the first one was that it needed to stabilise and then significantly reduce debt. The second was that it needed to achieve and maintain a fiscal balance by 14-15. The third was that it wanted to maintain a competitive tax environment to really encourage business to continue to operate in Queensland. And the fourth one was to target full funding of long-term liabilities. That's very much around the defined benefit fund. Anyone here in the DB fund? In the Queensland government view. We're really on our pat in Australia in that context, in that essentially the defined benefit fund is fully funded. It is a really, I think, great thing that historically governments in Queensland have done, and certainly also goes down very well with our ratings agencies. So in 12-13, the budget was brought down on September 11 or 9/11. I remember the Treasurer came back and said to me in July, right, I've talked to the Premier, we're going to bring down the budget on 9/11. And I said, was there a communications person in the room when you decided on that date? You've got to love boys, I think, is the answer on that. So in the 12-11 budget, we actually implemented $7.8 billion in remedial measures over the forward estimates, which is slightly contrary to John's book on public sector budgeting, which basically, you know, which as I said is, you've got $1,000 of revenue, what do you want to do with your $10? The government had to make an awful lot of very hard decisions in that budget, and anyone that thinks they were easy decisions doesn't know people, and I think doesn't know politicians, because I don't know that anybody would willingly want to take some of the measures that were taken. But certainly the very strong view from the position that the Queensland government is in is that there was no option other than to significantly reduce expenses over the forward estimates. So between 06-07 and 10-11, revenue grew. From 2000 to 05-06, revenue grew at about 10% and expenses grew at about 6.5%. That is good. From 05-06 through to 10-11, expenses grew at around 10% and revenue by about 6%. That is bad. And I'm quite happy to have the discussion with anyone around the need for counter-cyclical fiscal policy in a time of declining revenue. It is a very interesting conversation when you look at it from a state perspective as opposed to from a federal perspective. So in a federal government perspective, there are a lot of arguments to say you should go to counter-cyclical fiscal measures. In a state perspective, the position is much more academically interesting than that, and to that extent, if you Google, I noticed you had a great Google sign up before, a report that was done last year for the Victorian Treasury by Deloitte Access Economics, and it talks about, in essentially, the futility of counter-cyclical fiscal policy by state governments. So, in other words, it's saying state governments running big deficits in a time of declining revenues might not necessarily achieve anything like the same outcomes as a federal government doing it. So they're the 4 fiscal principles which were read into Parliament and which is now guiding the fiscal policy of the state. So where are we at? The fiscal balance for 12-11, the actual fiscal balance was $8.6 billion. We say that for 13-14 it's going to be $7.6 billion, and in 14-15 we say that that will be a small deficit of $244 million. Now, on the face of it, that flies in the face of the second fiscal principle of achieving a fiscal balance positive by 14-15. However, that is how the numbers fell. It remains a goal of government to actually achieve a fiscal balance next year. And then you can see in 15-16 and 16-17 that the position improves. Does anyone here actually get the difference, hopefully John will, between a fiscal balance and an operating balance? Perhaps the better question is, does anyone care? The easiest way to think about it, because you hear this language a little bit around the traps, if you have an interest in government finance, I think it's a good thing to understand, is you just look at it from your normal household budget. So if you're getting $1,000 a week in revenue and you spend on non-capital items $1,200 a week, then you've got an operating deficit of $200. If every week you spend another $60 on capital that isn't matched by revenue coming in, then you have a fiscal deficit of $260. And then you go, well, hang on, what's wrong with government borrowing for capital? And the answer is arguably nothing, so long as it's productive capital. So it's about good debt and bad debt. If you're borrowing money to pay wages or you're borrowing money for social infrastructure that doesn't have an actual economic return, then you can actually do that for so long before banks will stop lending. That is the reality. As opposed to debt for productive assets that actually generate a return for government or generate a return for the economy such that there is an additional return for government. So non-financial public sector debt is rising from $69 billion in 12-13, and we say that will stabilise in the early 80 billions by 14-15. So that's the position of the government at the moment. The actual expense growth for 12-13, and I get quite excited about this, and people say, well, you should tell more people, and I go, no one cares. The expense growth for government in 12-13 was 1.1%. That is the lowest level of expense growth since accrual accounting was introduced in 1988-1999, and compares with an average over the past 10 years of just under 9%. So to say that I think every agency has come on board with understanding the pressures the government's facing, and hence the pressure on making sure that we can continue to deliver community services, I think is extant. And I think that the fact that that has been achieved shows that more and more people are understanding the need to make sure that we're continuing to deliver the services that people require, but that we're doing it in a financially sustainable manner. Employee numbers, you can see from 02-03 through to 11-12, it was a very steady trend line. And then, as most people in this room would be aware, there was a reduction last year, and then not only is there a reduction, we're then holding down the future growth. That represents an awful lot of the fiscal recovery that we're doing. Most of the damage was done on the expenses side, hence most of the repair also needs to happen on that side. We say, as I said before, that gross borrowings will stabilise at around the $80–81 billion by 14-15. And that will really help our debt to revenue ratio, which is a key thing for the rating agencies. It's fine to say, well, why does Queensland need to be AAA? What's the big deal about AAA? And of itself, it's an interesting conversation and probably not much more than that. But what does it actually mean? It means you get your debt cheaper. When I first became under Treasurer, it's all about the margin you pay for your debt. And when I first became under Treasurer, Tasmania was borrowing at a lower margin than Queensland. Let me just let that settle in the room for a moment. We've improved, not surprisingly. The fiscal deficit, as you can see, that crossover that I was talking before about revenue versus expenses growth really crossed over in 06-07, and the gap was simply getting wider. Doug McTaggart actually gave me an update graph on that yesterday, and actually crosses back over next year, which is very cool. Size of government, so state government expenditure as a percentage of gross state product. You can see there, if you go back to 1983-84, Queensland was second behind Western Australia. Then by the early 90s, we were actually beating New South Wales, as well as beating Western Australia, and essentially the same as Victoria. And then from the... I haven't got a pointer, sorry. Oh, hang on. This will be interesting. They can smell fear, these things. Okay, there we go. And you can see there from 07 and 08, it just started to choke up and just kept going. That's just unacceptable. There's no reason that Queensland had to become such a high-cost state in the delivery of government services. So this, I think, then naturally leads into a discussion about, well, okay, you've got to do some fiscal repair, however unpleasant some of those decisions may have been, but it actually then provides the scope to say, okay, let's just have a really good conversation about what are we here to do. And now, first and foremost, government's here to do, and you're here to do, what the government of the day says are its priorities. There's nothing political about that. That is simply the reality. So what the Commission of Audit report did, and I don't know if anyone's read it here, I have, is really talks about, okay, well, who should be doing what? But the first conversation needs to be, should we be doing it at all? Or if we are going to be doing or delivering a particular service or ensuring that a particular service is being delivered, who should be doing it? So this talks about the public provision versus the private provision of services. Did Doug talk about this at all yesterday? Okay, there is a God. So it talks about things like legislation. It says, look, you know, You might get in some outside consultants to help you with thinking about legislation and to help you with thinking about that key public policy space. But at the end of the day, that's probably a really key thing for government to keep its own paw on. And then you think about things like defence. I live at Mitchelton and I drive past the inaugural Army Barracks of an afternoon. Can I suggest to you that 30 years ago, if you'd driven past the inaugural Army Barracks, you would not have had private security guards standing at the front guarding the boom gate. Now, if the threat level changed, I guarantee you that those private security guards would become actual soldiers. But for the threat level as it is at the moment, private security guards can do that. So they've mixed and changed who provides what service within defence. Then you go to things like courts. So the government's outsourced in the last year its court reporting services, which should be done at most other levels of government in Australia for some time. And then you think about prisons, and at the moment in Queensland we've got a mixed model where some prison services are provided by the public sector, some are provided by the private sector. You look at health and education, and I find the thing with the health and education space interesting. Mater Private Hospital, or Mater Hospital, has been providing public health services for nearly 100 years in Queensland. So some of the things that the government's doing at the moment in the provision of health services is not different. It's actually been happening at Mater for over 100 years. And I think another thing, just in terms of how, if you get your strategy right and you get your structure to follow your strategy and then you put in place the right policies where you can actually get good outcomes, is in the area of the health and hospital networks. That more localised accountability, I think, has been a fantastic driver of greater efficiency within the delivery of health services, but more importantly, a better delivery of health services. So if you want to look at elective surgery waiting lists, if you want to look at ramp times, if you want to look at and a lot of this data is now published, so you can actually go and look at it, I think that's actually moving in a really strong direction. Transport and infrastructure, the private sector is a ready builder of a lot of this space. Therefore, why would government want to stay in that? And I think you were talking before about airports, and it's important to get cost recovery. And you're right, cost recovery can of itself actually mask an awful lot of inefficiency. The flip side is if you're going to outsource something, you need to make very sure that you've got your regulatory framework right if it's a service that people must use to ensure that you don't end up with very bad economic outcomes for the community. Utilities, a lot of utilities are now provided by the private sector, and then at the end, banking and finance. So if you went back 15 years in Queensland, we had our own insurance company. You had to have your own bank if you were a state government in the 90s. If you weren't, you were missing out. No one does it anymore because the answer is the private sector very ably fulfils that role. So the government's got to achieve better value for money and service delivery. Business as usual is not going to get the state back to a sustainable footing. And the primary responsibility of government has to become to ensure that the services it wants delivered are delivered, but not necessarily by the agency, with the agency overseeing the delivery of services. So this concept of enabler versus doer will certainly hear more in the public service lexicon over the years to come. State public sector wages, Queensland relative to all state averages, you can see that absolutely shot up in 07 and 08 to an unsustainable level. It is coming back down now, but there's no reason that we should be above the all state average. Frontline service delivery, so this is the cost of service provision by state. This was in 10-11. Queensland was massively above the other states. So you look at New South Wales, they're at 96% of the average value, whereas at Queensland was at 106. And Victoria, I'm not sure if I've got the slide here. Hang on a tick. Yeah. The classic one for me on this is when we talk about enabling, we talk about doing, we talk about what we should be doing. They are all subsets of productivity, which I get is not a particularly exciting topic, but let me just keep going for a minute. You go back to 07 and 08, just baseline. So there are expenses, there was your weighted activity units. Now, in the health sector, anyone here from the health sector? You measure everything. It's really cool. You measure everything. So it's one of those areas that it is much easier to compare service delivery in health services around the states than it is on a whole lot of other things. I'm not saying it's completely 100% right, but it's certainly a lot easier to compare in weighted activity units in health compared to a lot of other government services. Between the period 07 and 08 and 11-12, recurrent expenses increased 147%. And the actual productivity of that, the actual units of production that we got out increased about 112. Like, that is just a huge amount of money for no improvement in the actual activity units of health services being provided to the community. Now, that to me is just, and keep in mind the health budget's about 25% of the state's overall revenue, sitting at around $12 billion. That is, I think, one of the most frightening or concerning graphs that I saw come out depicting the bit of a muddle we got ourselves in a state finances sense. So that needs to improve. The goal for us has got to be to achieve the highest standard of excellence and ensure that we're the best administered state in Australia. There's no reason that we can't be. When you look at the will of government at the moment to ensure that we do better and better, this government is also, if you're doing things that don't need to be done, we need to be raising that, and we need to stop doing some things. It is terribly difficult. We all get how terribly difficult it is at times in your role to understand how what you're doing contributes to some form of outcome for the community. But if we can't make those linkages, and if we can't actually say why we're doing something and how it actually contributes to an outcome within the community, then why are we doing it? So it's actually incumbent, I think, on everyone in the public service to be really looking at what they're doing, how they're doing it, and if it's not actually contributing to service delivery or to the achievement of service delivery, then absolutely rethinking why that's the case. You'll see lots of blueprints around at the moment. So the answer is we are all dealing with public money, so there continues and must be very high standards of financial management. I met with Andrew Greaves this morning, the Auditor General. We were each talking about what we were nervy about. It was all right, he paid for coffee. Innovative service delivery, including greater use of the non-government sector. So we're seeing that in road building now. We will see it in the delivery of some health services. We will see it in the delivery of some disability services. I was lucky enough about 6 weeks ago to be out on the north side with Uniting Care at some of the domestic violence refuges, as well as group support homes for teenage foster children that can't get foster family, which is incredibly sad. And just looking at how we can work with NGOs and how we can work with all types of the sector to be achieving what government wants to be achieved from service delivery. So, but the key outcome has got to be increased productivity and performance, and either the same customer service outcome or better, given that the decision's been made that service is to continue. So, the Commission for Audit report that came out in April had 155 recommendations. The majority were accepted and 18 are under active consideration. Can I suggest, if you don't read anything else, just read the about 12-page report that came out with that, and I think it gives you a real roadmap for where the government's seeing the reform journey over the years to come. So the best way to expand and improve our services is to fundamentally change the service structure and manage it, this concept of enabling, not doing, and that needs to be underpinned by flexibility and responsiveness. So we'll be seeing a lot of changes in the public sector as a consequence. The issue of contestability is probably also a word that people will have heard. Just to be clear, it's not an outcome. There are some services where it will be most efficient for them to be continued to be delivered by government. But again, it gets back to what are we doing and what are we actually achieving. So it may be a mix of public, non-government or private sector delivery models. What does that mean for us? I believe that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to absolutely look at across-the-board reform within the delivery of government services. It is underpinned by a sense of urgency because business as usual isn't going to sustain us. We've got the fiscal story very clear as to why we need to change. What we need to do now as leaders within the public service is take our staff with us on how we can improve service delivery and how we can do it in the most efficient manner for government. I'm very happy to take questions, as long as they're not hard. If they're hard, I'll be asking someone else. Yeah, so I'm not staying for the panel discussion, sorry. So if anyone wants to chuck something or ask something, please go for your life. Anyone awake? No? Okay, thank you very much. Oh, no. Oh, hang on. Somebody thinks there's a prize.
No, you stirred it.
Hi, thanks very much for a really good presentation. I enjoyed that greatly. I'm actually over from the UK, so I'm very much a visitor to Australia at the moment.
Oh, so you're the inbound tourist. We knew there was one of them here. Yeah.
You've talked a lot about public services. I wonder if you'd like to comment also about, if you like, governance and democracy in a context of austerity as well. Maybe not directly part of your brief, but I think public services are always need to be linked in a way to thinking about democracy within a society.
I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Can you just expand?
Well, you've talked about the fiscal principles.
Yep.
And about particular trends and projections, economic projections and so on. What does that mean in terms of what kind of society you want to have as a Queensland state, and where do the politicians fit within that?
I won't even pretend to try and put on a political hat and answer that, but I think that from what the conversations I've heard them say, I think it would be very much about that they're wanting to very much take the Queensland people with them, that the models of how we do things need to change, that people need to understand that we're very keen to work with them on how those services should be delivered, more particularly in terms of the growth of small business and the growth across the economy of the different pillars that support growth, understanding how government can work with them, but the government doesn't have the answers. So what can we help facilitate as opposed to what we can do? I think there's always a real risk when government thinks it can actually make things happen. In other words, the overstretch bit. I think that the focus on red tape reduction across the board, so we're working with all sectors of the economy on that, and certainly in my area that's a key thing for us, to try and help understand how we can help business and small business, and more particularly families in general, navigate their way through. So that's been the whole concept around the open data revolution, so the amount of data that's now being published, that's freely available to everybody, the way we're dealing with right to information, that if something's released, it's released very publicly, is trying to say we should be part of the community, not separate from the community. And I think that's a strong message, and I think that message will try and, I believe the politicians will try and continue that. Having said that, I don't see a lot of difference in political colour between actually trying to do that. I think that is a modern political way in Australia of trying to interact with communities. I don't know if that goes part of the way to what you were talking about.
Question there. Can we just get that one question there?
Is it easier?
I think she's indicating it might be.
There is a God.
Thank you.
I was just wondering what you see as the key risks in implementing the changes that you've proposed today.
Oh, look, revenue, you know, every 1 cent, so we our parameters this year for our budget were at 101 Aussie-US cross exchange rate. Every 1 cent drop in the Aussie dollar basically delivers to our bottom line about 33 million. So you go, well, it's dropped 10 cents, you're up 330 mil. The coal price has dropped, so I think we're basically keeping our head above water in terms of that revenue change at the moment. The whole level of, you know, everyone talks about confidence. I'd love to know what is that? I think we all say it, and we all feel in our tummy that we know what confidence in the community means. But trying to actually unpack that and work out how we can all help with confidence is actually a much more difficult conversation. I'd love to see the people dropping their savings rates and actually being content to spend more. I'd love to see inter and interstate tourism pick up. So we're seeing in the last 12 months there has been a healthy jump in overseas visitor numbers, so thank you very much for coming here from England, and thank you very much for coming here from Canada. It's lovely to see that more inter and intrastate. So with the Aussie dollar being where it has been, a lot of people have been travelling overseas. It'd be nice to see them spend their money at home. The tourism product in Queensland, I think, is improving. But again, if you had that confidence more happening, I think you'd see more money being spent at home. But the retail and construction, if we could actually see those two really important areas of, I think, things that are an outcome of people feeling more confident improve, that would be great. So I think that's an ongoing risk. You know, we're hearing, you know, in a stamp duty sense, we're tracking to where we thought we would be in a stamp duty sense, but that's off a really low level. So it would be great to see people having more confidence to, change homes, build a new home, or upgrade or buy an investment property. Because again, I think that is a harbinger of increased confidence. It would be lovely to see retail sales go up so that we could actually get a GST windfall, as opposed to consistently paring that back. I think just a vote of confidence in my Treasury colleagues federally, and I was lucky enough to catch up with Martin Parkinson a couple of weeks ago for a drink. And it's fine to say, oh, well, look how much stuff changed in 11 weeks or 12 weeks, whatever it was. The best indicator at any time of what the future of an exchange rate is doing is what the forward exchange rate is. It's a live market, huge numbers of people playing it. That is the best indication of the forward rate. 12 weeks ago, it was 101 cents. So that's had a massive impact on the federal government. And I think it's very easy to sit in seats and go, well, federal treasury is terrible. They're just not. This is just a very difficult time in a forecasting sense. The people that do these forecasts, I'm sure at a federal level and I'm sure at a state level, there is no vested interest in it. They're genuinely very bright people taking into account a whole lot of variables and saying this is what we think. So, I think that hopefully we couldn't be any less in our stamp duty than where we're at, but it would be lovely to see that improve. That to me is a risk. Our GST payments that come from all of you good burgers spending money in shops, they go to the federal government, they get returned to us under what's called horizontal fiscal equalisation. If you could spend more, that would be a lovely outcome of today, if that's okay. I think that is an ongoing risk. Gambling taxes are down in the state. My personal view is I really don't mind about that. I'm not so keen on that stuff. But gambling taxes are down. Again, that is a bit of a harbinger of confidence that people aren't having a punt. But again, I don't want to get too caught up on that particular level of taxation. Payroll tax numbers are holding to where we're modelling, so because that's a key source of revenue for the state. So overall, I'm pretty confident about our expense management at the moment. I think we've got some really good systems in place. I think everyone's got the message. I see the major risks to the state more on the revenue side. But again, we've really forecast that, and I'm sure it's the same at the federal Treasury level. There is no political interference in that. It is what the bureaucrats, the best view of the bureaucrats is. So hopefully we're okay, but to me that is where the real risks are. And for the beef producers in the room, 20 years ago would you have thought that dressed and undressed weight would be where it is now in a dollar sense and not in a fit. So that sometimes markets just don't behave as one would like.